All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 11, A Nation on the Move, Westward Expansion, 1800 to 1860. Here we'll be looking at Section 1, Lewis and Clark. So this chapter, as you can see in the title, is really about the United States expanding westward. One important point to highlight here in this chapter in particular is specifically the role of slavery in westward expansion. As we'll see as we approach closer and closer to this crucial year, 1860, 1860 being the year that South Carolina seceded from the Union, and the very next year, the Civil War broke out. A lot of the buildup to the Civil War, the breaking apart of the North and the South, has to do with slavery, but specifically slavery in the Western territories. Essentially, there's a nation, beginning in 1800 or whatever time you want to use, that is half free, half slave. The North is free. And we'll just sort of maybe remind ourselves. The North is free. The South is slave. Well, what is the West then, right? And really, it's trying to figure out this question mark that kind of gets the ball rolling in terms of the serious problems between the North and the South, and eventually leads down that path towards the Civil War. So just think about that in this chapter. But we're going to start, pretty much from the beginning, and that is with Lewis and Clark. Now, in terms of westward expansion, westward exploration, for a very, very long time, Europeans, all sorts of different countries, had hoped to find a Northwest Passage in North America. This is essentially what Christopher Columbus was looking for all the way back in 1492. The Northwest Passage, or a Northwest Passage, is an all water route to Asia. Essentially, was there a river that cut across the United States, or cut across North America, more accurately? And many countries had hoped to look for that, including the French, the Americans, etc., etc. Lewis and Clark also would be interested in finding if there was an all-water route to Asia, to the Pacific Ocean. Now, the focus on the West for the United States really intensified with the Louisiana Purchase. Recall that the Louisiana Purchase occurred in 1803 under President Jefferson. Much of the interior of the United States, or I should say North America, because it's not the United States at this moment, much of the interior of North America had already been explored by the French. They had been trading furs in that particular region for a very, very long time. But the then ruler of France at the time, in 1803, decided that the French would give up their empire in North America and sell the land to the United States. So we might say of Napoleon, sold land to the U.S. And, we talked about the Louisiana Purchase in a previous chapter that doubled the United States, but the United States had essentially bought a whole bunch of land and really didn't know what was out there. And this is where Lewis and Clark come in, because Thomas Jefferson hired these two individuals to lead an exploration party of this newly purchased territory, and with all sorts of different purposes. So a corps of discovery was established. This was to, we'll just say the goal was to explore newly purchased land. These two individuals, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, were in charge. We might say led the expedition. When you hear about the Lewis and Clark expedition, it just sounds like it's two guys in a canoe. The expedition itself was actually like, 40 men or something like that. There were a lot more people that were involved there. And, they ultimately had a lot of different purposes or goals. One was hopefully to establish trade relations in the East with China. It was to get in on some of the lucrative fur trade that, the French had already had. The British were in the fur trade in that particular region. One was to legitimize the U.S. That was to essentially kick out all other European competition. Remember, the United States is still a very, very young country. It's not seen as entirely legitimate in the eyes of other European powers. And the United States wanted to make its mark and ensure that that land that was sold by Napoleon to the United States really belonged to them. The United States and Thomas Jefferson also ordered Lewis and Clark to establish friendly relations along the way. This was for the purposes of establishing trade and for ensuring safety for future settlers. Peaceful relations weren't always established, but at least in many cases that was the goal. And simply just to document everything. A lot of this was a fact-finding mission in some senses. So document the various types of animals, the various types of plant life, document the geography. This purchase, when Thomas Jefferson purchased Louisiana from the French, initially Jefferson only wanted to purchase the city of New Orleans. That was it. And so when Napoleon offered pretty much all of France's possessions for a very good price, Thomas Jefferson couldn't refuse that deal and just made the purchase. And a lot of this was about, okay, well, what did we as the United States, what did we just buy, essentially? Along the way, Lewis and Clark were assisted by Sacagawea, a Native American woman, wife of a French fur trader. So we might say of Sacagawea, a Native American woman who helped Lewis and Clark. She served as a translator, helped to maintain more peaceful relations along the way. And one thing that Lewis and Clark did was to pass out these peace medals, which I believe were these kind of like coins almost. I guess they were medals. And I think they actually had Thomas Jefferson's face on it, but this was a way to create friendly relations between the United States and Native Americans along the way. But it was also a way for future settlers, when they came into contact with tribes along this trail or along the Western territories, if the tribes contained these peace medals, then it was sort of, safe, so to speak. So this was kind of a way of maybe establishing, we'll say, diplomacy. All right, diplomacy along the way. Now, ultimately, a lot of stuff came out of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It took about a year. They made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way back. Only one person died along the way. Found a lot of information, established trade, established diplomatic relations, legitimized the U.S., did all those things. However, one thing that it didn't, and that was it did not find an all-water route across North America, and that's because it doesn't exist. So in other words, a Northwest Passage, right, a river that is, that could travel the whole, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a Northwest Passage did not exist. You can get across, you could get across the Americas, but you have to do so by either sailing north of Canada or south of South America. So this was not the case. One of the key rivals that the United States bumped into, you might say, along this expedition and exploration was Spain. Recall that Spain had been involved in South America for a very long time, longer than the English colonists, in fact, almost 100 years before the English colonists. It was Spain that had conquered the Aztec Empire, built a capital city in Mexico City, but really didn't have all that much activity in North America. Spain was more centrally located in South America. That's where they made their money. But they did have some outposts, specifically in the Southwest, and they were worried perhaps of American encroachment there. So there had been some tension, you might say, between the United States and Spain, specifically over the territory of Florida. Now, conflict between Spain and the United States even predates the U.S. itself. There had been conflict between the English colonies in Spain even before America declared independence. But one of the more recent developments were the wars between the United States and the Creek and Seminole Indians. We might say of the Creek and Seminole recent wars with the U.S. We're talking mostly around the War of 1812, right? Just to kind of give us an idea of what time period we're referring to. And in cases, Andrew Jackson led military expeditions against the Creek and the Seminole. And in many cases, they would retreat into Florida, retreat into Spanish territory. And this posed a problem for the United States. Andrew Jackson even going into Spanish Florida without proper authorization. This ultimately led to a treaty between the United States and Spain referred to as the Adams-Onis Treaty. So we'll go ahead and maybe highlight this point here. The Adams-Onis Treaty, we're going to say a treaty between Spain and the U.S. to give Florida, which had been for a very long time Spanish territory, to the U.S. So officially with the Adams-Onis Treaty, 1816, I believe is the year, Florida was given to the U.S. It also helped to establish a border between the U.S. and Spanish possessions. You can see here, this would be the dividing line between Spain and the United States. And of course, Florida here, which had long been a Spanish territory, now we can color it in blue. This is officially American territory. So that settled some of the territorial disputes between Spain and the U.S. Regardless, though, there were still often incidents in which people from the United States, without proper authorization or authority, would continue to encroach upon foreign territory. We call these individuals filibusters. So a filibuster, James Long is an example of one. A filibuster is, we'll say, an unauthorized invasion of foreign territory by, in most cases, we're referring to U.S. citizens. So especially along the border, you might say, there were, especially in the area of Texas, there were a number of Americans or U.S. citizens or white settlers, whatever you want to call them, we'll call them filibusters, that were encroaching into Spanish territory. And even though the Onis Treaty helped to establish some sort of resolution between the border disputes of the U.S. and Spain, sort of these types of encroachments will lead to further kind of conflict between the United States and, at this period, Spain.